Then I came back. I was 14 years old. My brother Roger told me to come to the gym. I went down there. I put those gloves back on, and all of a sudden I felt this feeling of empowerment because this is my sport. It found me. I found it.
Fight fans, this is an absolutely brilliant episode for career profiles, and it actually finally completes the Fab Four. We've already done Tommy Hearns, Roberto Duran, Marvin Hagler, and I suppose in some people's eyes this will be like saving the best to last, arguably, with Sugar Ray Leonard and his career profile. One that we've been waiting to do for quite a while, one that we're excited to do, and I'm sure you guys will be excited to listen to the various stories that we've brought to this episode. And we're not going to start the episode the way we normally do with this one. We're actually going to start a little bit differently. We're going to go more into Sugar Ray Leonard's background, but more into his family's background, to set a bit of context and how it all came about for Sugar Ray Leonard himself. Normally we would start by letting you know when Sugar Ray Leonard was born, but we're not going to do that. We're going to talk a little bit more about his family and how that family environment created what we know as Sugar Ray Leonard. And Johnston, we've finally got the Fab Four complete with this episode.
Yeah, it's funny because I always assumed when we started to do these career profiles that Sugar Ray Leonard would be one of the first would get done and complete. Ironically, he's been the last. It's strange because you just assume when you think of the Fab Four, you always think of Leonard first, or many people do. Maybe it's just the public opinion for or maybe just those that when we watch the telly, Sugar Ray's always the first name that's mentioned. But in actual fact, for boxing fans, I think that, fourth place, considering, the other three were quite magnificent as well, I can understand it. But saying that, I mean, watching some of these fights of Sugar Ray Leonard, what a talent this guy was and what a superstar. And I'm really happy to finally get this one in.
So as I said at the start, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to go further back into the origins of Sugar Ray Leonard. We're actually going to talk about Ray's dad first and foremost, Cicero Leonard. He grew up in the town of Mullins in South Carolina, and this is where we're going to begin the story of Sugar Ray Leonard, who actually fondly remembered his family's heritage in boxing when writing his autobiography. And he said, "Besides Joe Louis, my dad's other inspiration growing up was his father, Grandpa Bilge. How many of the stories about Grandpa are true and how many are myth, I suppose I will never know. Such as the time he knocked down Bell, his prized mule, with a single belt." Now, if this really did happen, then Bilge, 6'3" and 240 pounds of pure muscle, not the grandson he never met, was the best puncher in the Leonard family. Now, Grandpa Bilge also spent much of his Saturday nights with his pals, drinking home-brewed corn liquor and bragging about his strength. As Ray once recalled, Cicero was the son of sharecroppers, and Ray explained how hard he had to craft from a very young age. And he said, "My dad, like many black kids in the Deep South, never made it out of elementary school in the early 30s. Bilge, needing every healthy hand, put him to work ploughing the fields of a large farm owned by another man. For 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Daddy hauled tobacco and cotton and sweet potatoes. Grandpa Bilge was keeping a very close watch. If he did not do what he was told, he got a good whooping. Now, Bilge would wait until Daddy was in bed and beat him with a switch, the branch of a tree. My grandma Sally, as much as it pained her, didn't object. She knew her place."
I suppose it's just the times the kids would get a little bit of a slapping. To do it while he's asleep is a bit harsh. But, they by the sound of it, they seem to get along rather well. So on his only day off, Cicero would actually fight in a ring that he had built by himself on his front lawn. And this is what Ray said. He said, "As exhausted as my dad was on Sundays, his one day off, he took on any kid from the county who had the courage enough to fight him. He sometimes fought as many as 3 or 4 fights with few interruptions. After he put away the competition, which he did without much difficulty, he was cleaned up by his grandma and he lost only once in 47 bouts. Now, Daddy, who fought at 5'9" and about 160 pounds, was no Joe Louis, his absolute hero. But this was as good as a time to find out. Now, in 1941, when the war came, Cicero was separated from his family and he spent 3.5 years in the Navy. It wasn't until 1948 when he met his future wife, who was Geta, in the town of Gape in South Carolina, through his cousin Robert, who was actually caught in Geta at the time. And Ray says that his dad told Robert, "I'm going to take that girl from you." And he said, "No, you ain't." After a fist fight, Robert basically never dated Geta again. And Cicero actually persuaded his new young love, Geta's mother, Nettie Elliott, that was her name. She only ever allowed boys to sort of visit her daughter on Wednesdays and Sunday nights from sort of 6 till 9. She had a schedule. And Cicero asked Geta if he could stop by one Sunday evening and was granted permission from the mum. And they continued that throughout until Geta, who actually already had a son whose name was Roy. So that is basically a half brother of Ray's, by a man who was no longer around. It wasn't long until they got married, and obviously after he sought permission from the mum. So just a little bit of background detail on Sugar Ray's parents. So Geta and Cicero were wed, and we'll now talk about the next person that comes along. Obviously is the young family they're going to build, and Sugar Ray's a part of that.
Well, you know what's funny about that particular story is the fact that he actually fought. He fought with his cousin over who was going to basically date Geta, and obviously Cicero won that particular fist fight, and that's what made history. And for the first couple of years, Geta and Cicero remained in South Carolina before settling in Wilmington, North Carolina, where Cicero found work on the Coca-Cola assembly line. Now, they then started to build a family, having 6 children in all, with Ray Leonard, the third youngest, arriving on May the 17th, 1956. He was named after his mother's hero, the great Ray Charles. Now, Geta was a member of the church choir, and she was hoping for another singer in the family. Ray had 2 brothers, Kenny and Roger, and 3 sisters, Sharon, Sandy, and Bunny. Now, in 1960, they all moved again to Washington, D.C., in an apartment only a short distance from the capital. Cicero got a job at a grocery store, but after only a few years, they left the district to rent a house in nearby Sea Pleasant, Maryland. Then, in the late 60s, they moved to Palmer Park, which was a racially mixed lower-class area about 20 minutes from DC, and finally bought a place of their own on Barlow Road. Now, Cicero worked long hours at the 24-hour supermarket, S&R, while Geta worked as a nurse's assistant and looked after the kids, which were now joined by Ray's half-brother Roy.
Palmer Park, where Ray grew up, wasn't considered to be the most dangerous place to sort of grow up at, but it did have its fair share of troubles, and Ray actually explains the time he actually witnessed a serious assault. He said in his own words, "One afternoon, several of us were hanging out near the front entrance of the Palmer Park Recreation Centre when we stumbled upon an argument between a thug in the neighbourhood and a fat, mentally challenged kid. The guy suddenly took a wrench and pounded the kid's head over and over. The blood gushed out the way you see it in the movies. He didn't care that we were watching. He knew we weren't going to call the cops and help the kid. All we'd have is the rest of his friends coming after us." So it's just a story there which just shows you that he knew who to mess with at a very young age and who not to, and when to go to the police and when not to. If he ever did, probably not. Now, with rough parts of the neighbourhood in prominent sight, if you weren't looking for it, it was basically well known to be a bit racist. Well, it was racist, which was very still in plain sight. And although working long hours, the Leonard family struggled financially. Their relationship fell onto hard times, and they both began to drink heavily in the evenings, resulting in many fights, all one-sided, as Cicero apparently never raised his hand to his wife. But the root cause of these violent exchanges came down to Cicero's constant cheating with other women. He was caught red-handed many times with white women as well, which didn't go down too well for the family. He would feel the wraith of Geta's heartache when she would lose it and hurl pots and pans at her disrespectful husband. Now, Geta Leonard was one tough lady, and Ray said this: "People assumed that I inherited my fighting spirit from my dad. It actually came from her. I have never met anyone with more determination, and that includes Roberto Duran, Tommy Hearns, and Marvin Hagler. During fights, Ray would successfully intervene the fights between his mum and dad. And he actually recalled, as a kid, I felt that it was my responsibility to keep my parents from killing each other. I often threw my scrawny little body between them, as a ref does, to break them up.
Wow, what a crazy childhood that turned out to be. Everything seemed so rosy, didn't it, at first? And then, like any struggling family in the 60s, it just turned into a violent relationship. And I'm very surprised that we didn't hear any stories of Cicero actually beating on his wife, Geta. I'm actually surprised at the fact that it was quite one-sided in the respect that Geta was the one that was probably being the aggressor, and he was just probably standing there and taking all the shit. But I suppose he deserved what he got if he was cheating with women. And at that time, racial segregation was absolutely rife. So cheating with a white woman probably was more disrespectful to his wife than what it would be in this era that we're in now, because everything's completely different. That period of time, as we know, was so segregated, and blacks couldn't mix with whites, and it was just so bad at the time that must have been like a complete embarrassment for the family for that to have happened. But Ray's description of how things went down there, the way he had to throw himself in the middle of them, was, again, it happens in a lot of families behind closed doors that we never hear about. So to hear about this from Sugar Ray Leonard in his own words is quite compelling to me. Now, even though Ray had become the mediator at times between his mum and dad, he would still be punished. Not too often, but whenever he stepped out of line, and he was punished by Cicero. And Ray Leonard said, "Whenever my dad taught my brothers a lesson for acting up, which was quite often, though it didn't keep them in line for very long, his methods of discipline included an extension cord and making us bend down and put our heads between our legs while he hit us with his belt. Now, as a shy kid who mostly stayed out of trouble, I wasn't punished nearly as frequently as my brothers. Fights weren't always necessarily all taking place in the home between his mother and father. According to one of Ray's brothers, Kenny, his mum was walking up to the steps in front of our apartment in Wilmington when a woman from the same building, for some unknown reason, started to slap her around. 'As long as I live, I will get you,' Mama supposedly said. It only took a few months. Mama saw the woman about to enter the complex one day, got her knife and went after her. The woman fell down and screamed but survived. Mama, I was told, went back upstairs as if nothing happened. Ray even recalled another incident that involved his mum stabbing his cheating dad. And Ray said, I was 6 or 7. The noise coming from the kitchen was louder than usual. But when I made my way back to the living room, he was already on the way out the door, with a knife in his back. I followed him outside as he slowly climbed the stairs to a neighbour's apartment on the 3rd floor. 'Can you pull this out?' he asked, and the neighbour did. The wounds were not severe enough for him to seek medical attention, but wow, what a pair of absolute nutcases these were."
Oh my days, unbelievable. Yeah, I believe as well in Ray's autobiography, he does say that his mum was actually taught how to use that switchblade by Cicero as well. So
the irony.
The irony of it, yeah, exactly. And I do wonder, with this other woman that supposedly just attacked her, I wouldn't be surprised if it probably was one of Cicero's other women, and he didn't shy away from it. You know, he was a bit of an arsehole like that, where he wouldn't disguise it in any way. You know, any affairs he had, it was open and everyone knew about it, and obviously it mugged her off, and she weren't the sort of person to mug off by the sound. Well, you know, by the sounds of it, she's going to put a knife in your back, quite literally. So I can completely understand when Sugar Ray says that's where he gets that aggressive side when he's in the ring. But, you know, he was a shy boy as well, Sugar. I called him Sugar already, but Ray. But the worst story of all actually came when Ray explained in his autobiography of an incident that could have ended in complete tragedy. Now, clearly upset with Cicero, Geta decided to take her 2 daughters, Sharon and Sandy, and her 2-year-old granddaughter. So I believe the 2-year-old granddaughter, whose name was Ting, would have been either Sharon or Sandy's daughter. So she decided to take the kids and her granddaughter to her mother's home in South Carolina. Now, Ray actually recalls this moment in great detail, and I think it was best for us to put it in from all Ray's own words. And he says, Mama was exhausted, but determined, as only she could be, to get out of town. It wasn't long before everyone fell asleep, including her. At around 2 a.m, sitting in the front seat, I was woken up by the sound of a car careering off the road, rocking back and forth, its lights flashing on one object after another, and all of us screaming. Then came the crash. I don't know if I was ever unconscious. The next thing I recall was seeing blood on the windshield, the steering wheel bent, and the jack from the truck cutting right through the back seat. It was a miracle that the jack didn't stab my sisters or my niece, and we suffered only minor injuries. Now, in a panic and with literally a badly split lip, by the sounds of it, her lip was almost hanging off, Getter scooped up the kids and went in search of a safe haven by knocking on random doors. Eventually, as Ray remembered, a nice couple let us in, and an ambulance arrived to take everybody to the hospital. Now, from there, we called Kenny, who drove Roger, my sister Bunny, and my dad in his Volkswagen to take us home. Now, how 9 of us squeezed into Kenny's bug remains a mystery. And Ray actually later admitted that the car accident, along with the fights between his parents, actually gave him nightmares for decades. So going into his adulthood, and he said, my only escape was the fictional world I would read about in comic books or invented in my head.
Oh my God, what an absolute crazy moment for them in their lives. So
Wow.
his mum's basically fell asleep at the wheel and they've gone off the road and they've all nearly died. So close. They're so lucky, to be honest with you. So lucky that they was all able to get out with minor cuts and bruises. And apart from obviously Getter, of course, with a badly split lip, but and how mentally scarring that was for Ray Leonard. And I never knew that. I never knew about that incident in his career because, you know, a lot of us as boxing fans, we tend to focus on a lot of the fights that these fighters have been in, the stories surrounding the fights. We don't always sit there and really go into great detail about that. Obviously, if you've read Sugar Ray's autobiography, then you'll know about this story, but it wasn't something I knew about because although I've got his autobiography, I've not had the chance to read through it in full yet. So it's great to hear about these stories and great to know a little bit more about Sugar Ray Leonard's upbringing, the fact that this mentally scarred him for so long. And incredibly, this wasn't the only time Ray cheated death. And he said, one spring afternoon, I went for a walk with a few friends along the creek near our house in Sea Pleasant when I slipped on the rocks and fell into the freezing water. Unable to swim and in a state of panic, I grabbed onto whatever objects I could, branches, logs, anything. It didn't do any good. The current was too powerful, dragging me downstream with alarming speed to a hole about 50 yards away where I might have easily drowned. Somehow, I clawed my way to the edge, walked through the woods, and was soon carried off by a friend's older brother to safety, to the relief of family members who had gathered in a nearby field after the word spread through the neighbourhood. I was brought home where my mother put cold towels on my head, my lungs filled with water, and I threw up for the rest of the day. We didn't go to the hospital because we couldn't afford to. Looking back, the experience taught me I could overcome any challenge, which was to prove vital in the years ahead.
So we almost lost Ray twice at a very young age, and you know the fact is like you said, it's you don't hear about these stories necessarily. See, when you find them, I think, especially when we're doing the career profiles, I think it's important that we do put these in. It also gives a bit of perspective on where Sugar Ray has come from in terms of his background, and it will make more sense the further we go on into the story as to the man that Ray become outside the ring, not necessarily as we all know inside it. And I think that's important that we always give that side of each fighter. But one day, young Ray did walk into the number 2 boys club in DC, several blocks from his home on 210 L Street, and ended up taking a beating of his life in the ring by one of the more established kids in the gym. He absorbed every shot the other kid basically dished out, but he didn't quit. He saw it through to the end. And when he left, he basically had one heck of an headache and some facial marks. Fortunately, his dad didn't notice the damage, and neither did anyone else in terms of his brothers and sisters or his mum. Before, as Ray said, returning to the much safer world of comic books in which the good guys prevailed over the forces of evil. So clearly those comic books were helping Sugar Ray mentally, really, as that young boy. But about 6 or 7 years later, it was Roger that actually convinced Ray to give boxing another try after that bashing he got. But he was also encouraged to join the new program at the Rundown Rec Centre by his best friend Derek Holmes, who had joined a few months earlier. Now, Ray loved it the second time around because he had finally found something he was decent at. And Ray said, I knew I was finally good at something, unlike my unsuccessful attempts to excel in basketball, track, and wrestling. He was basically too small and couldn't jump to be any good at basketball. He pulled a muscle every time he practiced or participated in athletics. He actually tore a ligament in his shoulder during wrestling, which he was participating in for about 6 months and never returned again. Within a few months of boxing, he had already knew how to throw a jab and avoid a left hook. But what pushed him was not the technique that he had learned, but in his own words, the power it instilled, the sense that I had control instead of being a victim. In the ring for the first time in my life, I felt I could conquer any force. Strange, isn't it? The ring is where men try to do great harm to one another, and it was where I felt the safest.
Again, you can only say wow to that quotation from Sugar Ray Leonard and the way that he was able to have the will and determination to go back to the gym and actually the second time around realise that he's got the natural ability to be good at this, to be good at boxing, and how he ended up feeling so safe in the ring after it all. Now, the three guys that ran the boxing program, Dave Jacobs, aka Jack, Pepe Correa, and Jenks Morton. Jake, a former boxer and AAU champion, would take some of the boys to his house almost daily to watch films of the all-time greats such as Willie Pep and Jersey Joe Walcott, and of course the great Sugar Ray Robinson, on his projector and show them how to execute the right cross and left hook. Pepe was the disciplinarian, and Jenks believed in fitness as the key to success. So all three brought something different that helped young Ray to begin his progression through the ranks at amateur level. Ray was determined to improve by opting to run to school rather than take the bus, fighting older and bigger kids during training and imitating his heroes such as Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali, although he quickly discovered that Ali's style suited him best and left him with less facial damage. Of course, he would come home with the occasional black eye, which his mum wasn't happy about, but it kept him off the streets and it kept him out of trouble. Ray was wise enough to identify a different path that he could take as a young black kid and said, there were two ways of getting your name in the newspaper if you were a black teen in the DC. The bad way or the good way. The bad way was through the police blotter. The good way was through boxing, the winner's picture appearing in the Washington Post.
My older brother Roger used to beat me up for no reason. Seriously, he would just beat me up because I was there. And one day he told me to come down to the boxing gym. Yeah. I followed him down there. I put the gloves on, and all of a sudden I felt this amazing sensation. And within 6 months to a year, I kicked his butt. My mother was such a big fan of Ray Charles. And so she named me after Ray Charles. And we knew that there was no future for me when I was 6 or 7 because I can't sing. I really can't sing. Because when I started boxing, I watched old films of Sugar Ray Robinson, sure, who was my idol, along with Muhammad Ali. And I tried to emulate him because he was more than just a boxer. He was more of an entertainer. I mean, he dressed, he was impeccable with his dress, and he tap danced, and when he fought with, it was like more of an art than just pounding away.
He had a good head on his shoulders from a very young age, and these three guys really did impact on Ray himself, and they stay with him pretty much throughout. It just shows you from that young age, and the fact that his mum can see he's coming back with a couple of marks and that, but it's keeping him out of trouble. And not being funny, but Get is hardly one to talk with some of the crap he's basically witnessed as a young boy. She wouldn't have none of it. So I completely understand why she allowed him to keep going. And while learning his trade in the boxing ring, Ray and his pal Derek also worked at Dave's Supper Club, ran by a guy called Roland Kenner, who taught him a very valuable lesson. And Ray describes what he taught them. He told me and Derek that since only the heavyweights made a serious money as pros, we had to set ourselves apart from the others in our weight class. And the way to accomplish that was to be smart and articulate, dispelling the image in white America of the black prize fighter who could do nothing else in life. Now, he actually prepped them on how to conduct interviews for in front of cameras using his overhead projector, and he taught them a valuable lesson of language. And Ray was keen to adjust, and it became part of his training regime. He said, "I never stopped working on this area of self-improvement, just as I never stopped practicing my left jab and right uppercut." And I tell you what, this guy clearly made a massive influence on him, because you see it from a very young age when you watch all of his interviews on YouTube and going into adulthood, and how hard articulate he is today. It just shows you that, he really did conduct that and add that into his regime as well. I mean, it just shows you he was the whole package. Not only that, he was a very handsome fella as well.
Roland Kenner is certainly an unsung hero in the tale of Sugar Ray Leonard, really, isn't it? I mean,
He really is.
Professionals today don't even get that sort of treatment, and we're talking here the 1970s, when this was all happening, when Ray was boxing as an amateur and coming into to his career. And you think about what we have today, the technology, everything that we have in this day and age, and yet there's a lot of pros out there that don't have people like a Roland Kenner to teach them how to do interviews, to essentially, make them act in front of the camera, give them that confidence, that self-belief of how to deal with certain situations. And I think when you look back at this, you can actually say that there's a lot of fighters, promoters and managers, even in 2020, that could probably learn from this particular quotation from Sugar Ray Leonard about his career, and of course the influence that Roland Kenner had. So we move on to Ray and his obviously school life now, and he actually attended the Parkdale High School while continuing his progression in boxing. Now, he actually dealt with a bully much bigger than him and beat up his brother Roger for the first time after he made his usual sneaky advances. It was at the point that Ray realised he had natural skill and power for a little kid. His other hero became Bruce Lee, and he even tried to mimic his technique. Ray said, "Lee inspired me for years, long after I turned pro. When I threw punches at my sparring partners, I made the same noises he did during his fierce exchanges. I wish I could have met him." It wasn't long before he fought in the amateurs for the first time, and asked his dad to come along and watch. "You can't fight," his dad said. Ray replied, "Just come and watch me, Daddy." He, of course, got rid of his opponent with ease, leaving his dad as proud as punch.
Yeah, it's again, I mean, the Bruce Lee inspiration and Sugar Ray, like, sort of trying to mimic his movements, as well as realizing that it was better suited to try and match the style of Muhammad Ali over his other hero, who was Joe Frazier. I mean, and then you got these other guys that are giving him great wisdom. It really just tells you the bigger package and the bigger story behind Sugar Ray Leonard and why he was so successful. It really does. And so after that first win in the amateurs, Ray continued to improve in almost every department. So it was inevitable that he would face the main man in Washington at the time, and his name was Bobby Magruder. Now, the Irishman of Scottish descent that resided in the States was known to be a bit of a power puncher, but he found Ray too elusive and too fast, who basically grabbed a split decision in Magruder's backyard of Little Italy. And people were stunned. They couldn't believe it. Now, Ray cherishes this moment as one of the most impressive of his career. And he actually said, "No fight ever meant more to me than the triumph over Bobby Magruder. By defeating the man in DC, I became the man. And if I could beat Bobby, I could beat anybody. We fought twice more for the Golden Gloves title, and in the finals of the AAU tournament, I won both times. But it was our first duel that propelled me to the next level. The next level was to start fighting all over the country." And it was during 1972, as a lightweight, when Ray made the quarterfinals of the national AAU tournament in Vegas, that he basically finally tasted his first ever defeat. He lost to a guy called Jerome Artis, who was just as quick as Ray. So, he was beaten to the punch, and he was a bit shocked by it. But it taught him a lesson that he can't win them all and that he wasn't invincible.
Now, at 16, Ray was selected to represent the US national team despite being a year underage. In Vegas, once again, he was knocked down to the canvas for the first time against Russia's Valery Love, but he dragged himself off the deck to win and pick up yet another vital lesson. Heartache and controversy would be Ray's next boxing education. He lost by a poor judging decision in the US Olympic trials in Cincinnati against Greg Whaley. Now, after the fight, Tom Sarge Johnson, one of the Olympic coaches, approached him in the dressing room and told Ray, "Don't worry, Sugar Man. I'm sure you'll make the team in 76. You'll be more experienced. The lessons you take home from here will make you a much better fighter." Of course, we have to discuss how Ray got the nickname Sugar, and many believe it was in fact Sarge that created it after he told people that he was sweeter than sugar. The truth is, he didn't, but Ray never bothered to correct this version. He even confirmed it for years just because it was a good story. The nickname Sugar Ray was created by Ray himself. "I did it out of respect for the incomparable Sugar Ray Robinson, whose fights I knew almost punch by punch." To add even more class to the correct story, Ray spoke to the man himself. Some boxing writers later took me to task, arguing that there can only be one Sugar Ray, but Robinson in his 50s told me he considered it an honour that I adopted his nickname, and his opinion was the one that counted.
Well, there you go. That's an interesting story because, again, if you look online, you do find that Sarge is the guy by many articles that created that name Sugar and Sweeter Than Sugar. And the fact that Ray carried it on, and never corrected that version, it just says to you that, he enjoyed that story. But I actually think the second story, the real original story, and the fact that he spoke to another one of his idols. I mean, the two idols of Sugar Ray Robinson and Muhammad Ali, there's no better than those two. And to be studying them two, you can almost see it in the way he fought. For me, he had unbelievable speed. We'll never know how fast Robinson was because we just couldn't get the footage of sort of today. But even still, I mean, what a great story. The fact that Sugar Ray said that he was honoured that he adopted his nickname, that's just brilliant. But back to the US Olympic trials, and Ray was struggling to make the 125-pound limit. He literally starved himself for 3 days and drank just water and juice. Even with the drastic diet that he had basically put together, he was still well over the limit. So to save face of not making weight, he actually took a dive. Now, this wasn't in the fight, and Ray explains. He says, "I have never admitted to this, but I faked a blackout. And frankly, it ranks as one of my best performances and lowest moments. I fooled everyone, including Dave Jacobs and the other coaches, and my mother, who did what I knew she would do by pleading to the staff not to let her baby fight. I was spared the embarrassment of not making weight. Looking back, I wish I'd been honest about the weight problem from the outset. At 16, there was much to learn." That's a great story from Ray. And also the fact is that he admits it, and the fact that he was that devastated not to make weight that he made up this crazy and took this dive and pretended to faint. Today we've got professionals just walking on the scales well overweight. Just shows you back then there was more to it. You had to make weight just to save face.
Well, it's all about getting to the Olympics. That was obviously his dream, and this is what he wanted to do. This is what he tried to do, and the fact that he was embarrassed about making weight, and the fact that he's basically coerced this event to happen by getting himself with a great dramatic performance of blacking out, knowing that his mum wouldn't allow him to go in there. It's great. It's great the way he's done it, and it's also great the way he's admitted to it years down the line in his autobiography, literally saying that this is what really happened. I didn't chicken out of the fight, essentially. I just didn't want to go in there because, I was embarrassed. I didn't make the weight. It's embarrassing. It was embarrassing.
Brilliant.
It was embarrassing back then. I mean, like you said.
It really was.
You said about today's era of boxing, people miss weight all the time, and what did they get? A slap on the wrist, and they're fighting again in a few months. Then it's a big thing. It was a big thing. To miss the weight was massively frowned upon, and this is why he decided to make that decision clearly. Now, 1 year later, and Ray met Juanita Wilkinson, and they became a couple. And then, at 17, they had a baby boy, Ray Charles Leonard Jr., on November the 22nd, 1973. Now, Ray was a young, narrow-minded teenager that concentrated solely on his quest to make the US Olympic team and then land a gold medal. This meant that he was absent from Juanita and Ray Jr. for weeks on end while pursuing his dream and playing the field. He even bedded Dave Jacobs to teenage daughters amongst other girls. Now, Ray admits to not feeling any guilt because, as some of us would believe, he was an adolescent that didn't know any better, but it was more than that. In Ray's autobiography, and he bares his soul and bravely explains the sexual abuse he suffered from a prominent Olympic boxing coach in the man's car. Months later, he suffered more sexual abuse from another man that he described as a short, bald, elderly white gentleman with huge lips whom I became friendly with in Hillcrest. It really is a disturbing description of what these two men did to Ray and how it affected him later in his life.
Crazy how it just takes this dramatic turn, because you're laughing at the fact that when you're sort of reading the book and you hear him sort of trying to get Juanita and the things he did to get Juanita, and it was quite funny, and then all of a sudden it just takes this twist, and you know, it is crazy. It literally from one extreme to the next, and he does go into detail. I mean, we was going to put some of the detail in here, but it's just no point. If you want to know what happened to Ray by these two guys, literally months apart as well, one of them was giving him money and they done what they done. It was clearly something that affected Ray, and something that, again, he never admitted this. It wasn't until the book dropped that people were like, holy shit, like no one ever knew. So he bared his soul in them pages. And, you know, if you're a Sugar Ray Leonard fan, if you're a boxing fan, I advise anyone to pick up the book, because it does take you through a journey when you read it. So hopefully we can do that with you guys. But I mean, I just not to move on too quickly, Sean. I don't know if you was ever aware of that, but I mean, wow, considering the upbringing he had with almost dying twice, and when his mum and dad fighting all the time, and then this is, it's quite shocking before he even makes the Olympics.
I concur with what you're saying about the book, and obviously it's been a massive inspiration for us in terms of the source material to put this together. Like you said, you could have quite easily put descriptions in of what actually happened, because he does describe it, but we don't want to bring that sort of stuff to the episode about Sugar Ray. Obviously we want to give you context to his life, his story, how he got to the top, of course. But we don't want to sit there and start graphically detailing everything that happened to him. If you really want to know about it, if you really want to read how grim it is, then of course pick up the book and read it. That's my advice. I've not read the book myself personally. I've said this earlier in the episode, but it is something that I've got on my list to do. And I was aware of the sexual abuse because I had seen interviews from him on camera where he talks about it in a little bit of detail. So I was aware of it. And I'm just shocked that it took him so long to admit to everything that had gone on. And as well, earlier on in his life, it's just shocking. It's just shocking that, you know, I was laughing when we was putting this together, when we was reading the notes for it before starting the episode. I was laughing because I was thinking, Sugar Ray Leonard, what an absolute player. And then in the next sentence, it's like, he then gets abused, and you're thinking to yourself, hang on a minute, how the hell did this happen? You know, he's a bit of a player at 17, and then all of a sudden he's getting abused by two men. It's horrific, and I'm not surprised it stuck with him for the rest of his life. I'm not surprised he's always going to be there with him till the day he dies.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, you got just enough respect to him. I believe it was someone else that came out and said that they had been abused, and it was that person that inspired him to want to come out and do it and say it himself. So, yeah, really awful that what he suffered there. But, you know, it must have taken a lot of guts for him to find that strength to continue in the sport and chase his dream of Olympic gold. But as we all know, that's exactly what he did. It was around 1973 that Ray began to suffer badly now with his hands. And this is a constant issue. And after every fight, the vigorous sparring sessions, Ray said that his hands felt as if someone had shot me with a jolt of electricity. My trainers and I tried possible remedies, with rubbing alcohol to Epsom salts to Ben Gay. Nothing solved the problem. The one remedy that did have a positive effect was winning. My hands did not seem to hurt quite as badly after I knocked someone out or under decision. Quitting the sport was just never an option for Ray as he continued, and he gained great experience travelling with the national team all around the world, and in preparation for the Montreal Olympics, he actually won the Pan American Games in Mexico. The hand problem was, again, I mean, we'll mention it again later on, but it's just something that he just managed to cope with and continue with, but they were bad.
It was on his travels that he actually built a rapport with the ABC commentator Howard Cosell, who covered all his amateur fights and gave interviews regularly, and he always came across very well to the American audience. All those media lessons with Jake Morton were starting to come to fruition. One day, Ray was asked to present an award to the greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali, and Ray recollects their first encounter. At a dinner table, Ali sat on my left. "How long do you stop having pussy before a fight?" he said with the same delivery as if he were asking me to pass the mashed potatoes. I almost choked on my food. "About 2 days," I answered once I composed myself. "2 days," he said without looking up. "You're a bad brother."
I met him through a friend. We had a chance to meet him. It probably was in Jersey or probably in Las Vegas. And I remember having a chance to sit beside him. And he was my idol. And I looked at him and he's talking. He said, hey, I know who you are. He said that to me. I know who you are. He said, you like boxing? I said, yes, sir. He said, how long do you wait before you're having sex? He asked me, he said, do you like sex? I said, sometimes. He said, how long do you wait before a fight, you stop having sex? I said, about a couple of days. You're a bad dude. You're a bad dude. He was so much to me, Muhammad Ali. And I went to his funeral, and strange enough, I didn't break down or anything, but 2 days after I got back home, I cried like a baby because I missed him. Just his presence and my friendship and my trust in him. And he always told me, he said, make sure you sign your own checks, make sure you stay in shape. And he gave me a lot of pointers that I've used then and I still use today as an entrepreneur.
That's quality. What a way to finally meet Muhammad Ali, and he drops that line on you. Yeah, quality stuff. Only Muhammad Ali, man. But so we won't be going through Ray's Olympic gold medal success in the Montreal Games. Instead, we were going to refer you to the BTR special, the 1976 USA Olympic boxing team episode, which is 167 on the main feed, where we discussed the Olympic trials success against Ronnie Shields, Sam Bonds, Bruce Curry, which was twice, by the way. Their second was a decision win for Ray Leonard in the box off in Vermont, which was the fight that was enough to guarantee him his place on the plane to represent the United States, the light welterweight division in those Montreal Olympic Games. So just wanted to send you that way. Go and have a listen and you can make it out. But we're going to give you a brief breakdown.
So, of course, we will give you a bit of a brief breakdown onto it. But as Johnson rightly pointed out, if you do want to listen to more detail about that, you can go over and listen to that episode. Now, at the Olympics, Ray actually defeated Ulf Carlsson of Sweden, gold medal favourite Valery Limasov of the Soviet Union, and Englishman Clinton McKenzie. Then Ray defeated East Germany's Ulrich Bayer in the quarterfinals, Kazimierz Skapa of Poland in the semi-finals, and then in the final, on Saturday, July the 31st, 1976, he whitewashed the dangerous Cuban Andreas Aldama. The gold medal match was his last as an amateur, making it his 145th win in 150 fights. Amazingly, he decided to retire from the ring after achieving his Olympic dream, but he did fondly remember the moments after the final bell, and he said, "The stadium went crazy. My supporters went crazy. I went crazy. The gold medal was mine." Once his accomplishments settled in, Ray then said, "I was proud for me and those who believed in me, my coaches, friends, family and fans. It was their triumph as much as mine, yet I felt as empty as I'd ever felt. It dawned on me that my career in boxing, which had changed me forever, was over."
Just crazy. Pick gold medalist, and he stuck by his guns. He weren't returning to the ring. I mean, that was it. He achieved what he wanted to achieve, and he called it a day. Absolutely got to respect it. And you do wonder as well if just what happened with those two guys in particular influenced that decision. But following his heroics, Ray did become a big deal in America, but he was still adamant to stick by his decision and his desire to not box again. Now, with his hands still in a bad way following the Olympics, and Janks Morton arranged basically a meeting with a particular guy that was going to be a huge impact in Sugar Ray's career, and that guy was Mike Traynor. He was an attorney who worked out of a small second-story office in DC suburb of Silver Spring. Now, Mike knew somebody with authority within a school that Ray wanted to attend, which helped him get awarded a non-athletic scholarship to the University of Maryland. Ray wanted to advance his education, and he actually said he planned to pursue a degree in business administration. I also wanted to help kids just as I was helped.
Now, considering what Ray had been through with the sexual abuse he suffered and his consistent hand troubles, you can't help but respect his decision to leave the sport, but there were other issues that forced Ray back. Now, Getter suffered a mild heart attack just before the Olympics, and no longer is able to work. Cesaro was hospitalised with meningitis and tuberculosis of the spine, so with the mounting medical bills that continue to rise, and in need to support his 3-year-old son Ray Jr., he decided to go professional. Ray Leonard told Sports Illustrated, "Even then, it wasn't an easy decision. I meant it at the time when I said I didn't want to fight anymore, but I felt I owed it to my family. They are down and I am capable of lifting them up and putting them in a good financial position." Through the relationship Ray had acquired through Mike Traynor, he was able to get the ball rolling to set up Sugar Ray Leonard Inc. Traynor worked for free while lining up Ray with Arthur Young & Co., an accounting firm, and a public relations man, Charlie Brockman. He then persuaded 24 friends and business associates to underwriting Ray's career with an investment of $21,000 to be repaid within 4 years at 8% interest. Finally, Traynor incorporated Leonard, the sole stockholder of Sugar Ray Leonard Inc. Ray was earning $950 a month, with the rest of his earnings being invested. To make double sure Ray would succeed, he selected Angelo Dundee as his manager on the recommendation of Muhammad Ali, who would only take 15% of what Leonard made as a fighter.
I just think about my career, how it started and where it ended. It was a journey. It was an incredible journey. And the ironic thing about it is the fact that I was not going to pursue professional boxing.
Yeah.
You know, after I won the Olympic in 76, I came home. My dad went to a coma. God, and I asked my mentor, James Morton, I said, how can I make fast money? He said, turn pro. I didn't give it a second thought. I turned pro and met up with some incredible people, Mike Traynor, my attorney, my friend, my partner, James Morton. I mean, my team, my corner was the best. I didn't want to, because I've heard stories about legendary champions, Sugar Ray Robinson, to name a few. They ended up with nothing. They made money, good money, big money back then, but at the end of the day, they had nothing to show for it. I mean, I didn't want that to happen to me. I didn't want to be a part of that. I was going to go to the University of Maryland, further my education, get a good job, and life goes on.
Wow. Mike Traynor, my goodness me, and Charlie Brookman, they literally lined him up. They set him up perfectly. I mean, we've never done a career profile like this where this guy, his attorney, has come in and he's basically created Sugar Ray Leonard Incorporated, and he was the director. He was everything. Sugar Ray was the man. On paper, it is Sugar Ray Leonard Incorporated, and that was it. It was beautiful. And to get those investors coming in, I believe that Traynor even put a little grand in himself to get it all rolling. It was beautiful. I mean, he could have just gone to any other promoter that were hanging around at the time, which we always hear about, but he didn't. And we'll explain now, I mean, how quickly this develops. And with Angelo Dundee as the manager, this actually came about, obviously, as you said, through Muhammad Ali. Now, Ray was actually invited to the third Muhammad Ali and Ken Norton fight by Don King. And it was at the fight that he actually met Ali once again. This time, they spoke in the dressing room before the fight. And this is what Ray remembers in his autobiography. "Are you turning pro?" Ali said. "I'm thinking about it. I haven't made a final decision." Ali stared at me, his quiet eyes like giant black saucers. "Well, if you do turn pro, just make sure you don't do what I did. Don't let anyone own you. Remember, you are the one in the ring, and most of the money you earn should belong to you." He added that if he did go pro, I should hire his trainer, Angelo Dundee. He was the right complexion and the right connections. That's brilliant. He has the right complexion and the right connections. Great line from Ali. And that's what Ali said. Now, although Angelo was Ray's manager and lead cornerman during fights, Dave Jacobs continued as his trainer in the lead up to fights. And a few weeks after agreeing to work with Angelo, Ray left DC to train at his base in the historic 5th Street gym in Miami Beach. And during this time, it was Don King that made his pitch to Sugar Ray. This is what Ray said that Don said to him: Ray, I can make you a fortune and you'll be a world champion. He offered a deal that would, as he promised, make me wealthy. Although King sold his pitch masterfully, as only he could, Ray said, I kept hearing the voice in my head, don't let anyone own you, from Muhammad Ali. And with that, he turned King down. So this apparently happened just before, obviously, he decided to turn pro. And in the background, you had the Mike Traynor discussions, setting up this incorporated firm. And wow, it turns down Don King. And what great advice from Muhammad Ali.
We've covered Don King in great depth for the darker side of boxing. The 2 Don King episodes that we've covered. If you've not heard them, go and listen to them. And in that particular episode, we do talk about Muhammad Ali and the way Don King literally fucked him over on multiple occasions.
Absolutely.
And the fact that Muhammad Ali is there and he's saying to Sugar Ray Leonard, cut the middleman out. That's what he's saying. Cut the middleman out. You take the money. You give what you need to give out to the people helping you, that are training you. Don't have a middleman. And Don King came onto the scene and tried to get Sugar Ray Leonard, and he didn't. And it's a great story from our perspective, because the amount of times we've seen Don King literally pick up a boxer and then throw him out when he's done with him, it's unbelievable. And the fact that Sugar Ray Leonard actually went alone on that was a very shrewd decision. So Sugar Ray actually made his pro debut then on the 5th of February 1977 at the Civic Center, Baltimore in Maryland, against Luis Vega, who was 14-8-3 in front of a crowd of 10,270 people. The fight was televised live by CBS on Sports Spectacular, with Ray being promised $5,000 for taking the fight. But it was Lou Grasmick, a local lumberyard owner and a commissioner of Baltimore's Civic Center, who then put up another $10,000 towards his purse. CBS coming up with another $10,000, and after the final gate receipts of $72,320, we collated it took Ray's total purse for his first fight to $40,044. That's a great figure for your pro debut. Nobody gets that in this day and age, do they? Leonard won every round in that fight, but Vega, who had never been down as a professional, stayed on his feet throughout the fight. Ray was quoted as saying, "It's beautiful, and with people I trust. I was always afraid of being just a piece of someone's property with no say in my career. I don't have to worry about that anymore, and as soon as I repay that $21,000, I'm my own man." And that is exactly what happened. He paid back his investors after only his first fight.
Beautiful. I mean, wow. I mean, you got to love that, ain't you? Mike Traynor has basically managed to gather this money. He knew he was a star. He gets himself $40,000 and he's out of debt. He's his own man. He's his own business. He's got his own business. He's just won his first professional fight, and he now literally is himself. He can just, all the attorneys, Mike Traynor, the attorney was doing, his manager, all he did and what Dundee did. Dundee was the matchmaker and Traynor was the guy that would literally find an opponent, approach the promoter in the area, and Bob's your uncle, get fight him. I mean, it is brilliant. It really is. It's just a great story when you hear that. And so after the Vega fight, Ray signed a lucrative 6-fight package with ABC for about $400,000 in rights fees. He then fought another 5 times in 1977, winning 4 by knockout or stoppage and the other by decision. Now, only 6-0, Ray had comfortably earned well over $100,000, but he wasn't without his critics, with many feeling he never had enough pop in his punches. Now, after knocking out one of those victims, Ray said, "I hope this shows that I do have some punching power. I've seen some criticism of it, but maybe the writers will change their tune." Now, during the summer of 1977, Ray continued to spend a lot of his spare time with many different women. He actually rented a separate apartment room, which he kept a secret from Juanita. And Ray recalls the moment he got caught. Although she had heard rumors, she didn't know for sure until she tricked a friend of mine into coming clean. And I still tried to deny it. Even after I told her the truth, I didn't stop using the apartment. Now, he would also spend more time with hangers on to the point where he became, as he said it in a phrase in his book, Ray the Bank. And he gave plenty of money away to so called friends and family. One family member that was always asking for money was Roger. And Ray said, there were problems I couldn't fix with money, such as Roger's addiction to drugs, which dated back to the early 1970s. Heroin was his drug of choice. Perhaps I could have made a difference if I paid more attention to him, but there was only one person I paid attention to, and that was the initials SRL. Instead of love, I gave Roger money. Even if we both knew it was what it was going on, I'm ashamed to admit I was worse than his dealer.
It's so difficult, really, to want to criticise him, because I do feel sorry for him, because I think to myself, again, he's still just a young lad at the time, and he does have a lot of good people around him, but yet, as a young lad, he's taking this newfound fame and he's using it to his advantage in the sense that he's going sleeping with all these different women and people are coming to him, and because he's got that much money, he doesn't care about it. He's just dead nonchalant with his money at the time, and his own brother, obviously Roger, he didn't even see the problems that were in front of him. He was feeding Roger's habit, and the fact that he's obviously admitted to that later on down the line just goes to show you the reflection he's had on his life, and the mark of a man that he ends up becoming in this story because of things like this earlier on in his life. Now, Sugar Ray had a very busy 1978 in the ring, fighting 11 times, picking up 6 knockouts, and bringing his professional career to 17-0. During this win streak, Ray had 2 significant fights that both went the 10-round distance, and a major decision was made in between those fights. The first was against Dick Eklund Jr., who was 11-3. You might know him as the half-brother of Irish Mickey Ward, who was played by Christian Bale in the film The Fighter. Now, in that fight with Dickie Eklund Jr., it was a one-sided point victory, but it was the first time where he started to lose his head on a few occasions because of the abuse he was suffering from the crowd before, during, and even after the fight. And to make matters worse, he also had a disagreement with Angelo Dundee while the fight was happening, which began a rift internally within his team. Although Ray and Angelo actually grew a stronger bond from it all, much of the infighting in-house came between Angelo Dundee and Mike Traynor. Even with that rift, Ray's career was moving along nicely, but the discrepancies in camp were present again when New England promoter Dan Doyle received a call around midnight from an anxious Angelo Dundee. He was worried because Ray's team had just agreed to fight Tommy Hearns. Angelo had just returned from a fishing trip in the Florida Keys when he called and said, "We can't fight Hearns, we're not ready for him." Angelo widely recognised the talent that Hearns possessed and feared the possibility of an upset. He also predicted that a fight between the two hot prospects would generate a lot more than the $100,000 that they had agreed, although Mike and some others in the camp were not best pleased with that decision initially. And then that's another great story that I have heard before about Angelo Dundee deciding that this wasn't the right time for Ray Leonard. Not because maybe he doesn't think he's got the talent, but more so because he doesn't think he's had that right level of opposition yet. And also the fact that they know that these two guys are eventually going to meet anyway, so why not do it when they make a lot more money out of it?
And I mean, we did mention this story in Tommy Hearns' career profile, and we did mention this, that he was ready to fight him, and Angelo stopped it. Absolutely bang on. The fact that $100,000 between we even done the splits in the old Tommy Hearns one as well. So you want to listen to that? It would give you a little bit more information in the background of that. But great advice there from Angelo Dundee. And so many observers described Angelo's influence in Ray's career as absolutely vital, and without him, Ray would not have had the success he had or would eventually go on to achieve. And that's something you do hear a lot from many observers, when you read articles, how much of he was a saviour, if you like. Now, it was important, again, we had to stick this in because this is Ray's version. This is his own personal opinion. And Ray was keen to clear up the misconception. And he said, Angelo was my official trainer, but he didn't train me the way people thought. I'd been trained already by Pepe Carrera, Dave Jacobs, and Janks Moulton. I used to laugh at the stories in the paper that gave the credit to Angelo for swooping in a week or two before every fight with the magic formula to get me ready. I mean, no disrespect to him, but if I did not have a strategy at that point, I wasn't going to find one in a few days. His true value was in the corner, during the battle, and as a matchmaker. In those roles, there was no one else who could have served me any better. So I think that's really interesting when he said that, is that for me, I always thought Angelo was a major influence. I mean, by the sounds of it, what Ray's trying to say is obviously as a matchmaker and directing his career was vital, and the role of him being his corner man, which geared him up, and he had that enough. And it was the other guys that he gives more respect to, the ones that actually trained him. So that is really fascinating to hear.
It's very good to hear because, like you rightly pointed out, there was a lot of people that, and maybe still a lot of people today, that still feel that Angelo Dundee was the mastermind behind Sugar Ray Leonard. And that wasn't always the case. And he said it himself, it's not the case. The guys behind it was Pepe Correa, Dave Jacobs, and Yanks Martin. And Angelo Dundee would come in to be the guy in the corner on the night, who would bring the experience factor to him because of the years of great events that he'd been involved with, of course, with Muhammad Ali. He had that experience on fight night, and the fact that he was able to matchmake him so well to get his career to a certain level. And that's what Angelo was there for. He was there to be in the corner on the night. He was there to matchmake the fights when Ray needed certain fights at certain times. He had his own pivotal role to play, but He's great that he's not forgotten about the guys that have got him there and that have maintained him throughout his career. The second significant fight in 1978 came against Roger Mayweather, who was 15-1, who was ranked 9th by the Ring magazine, and he was presented as a serious test. Mayweather was knocked down twice in the 8th round before being stopped in the 10th and final round. The Associated Press reported, aside from the first round, which Mayweather clearly won, with good flurries of punches, the only round in which he held his own was the 5th. However, his punches had lost most of their zing by then. Now, on January the 11th, 1979, Ray took on Johnny Gann, who was 44, 11-3. He was also trained by Angelo Dundee, but he made the decision to actually work in Ray's corner for the fight. Before a sellout crowd of 19,773 at the Capitol Center in Maryland, Ray stopped Grant in 8, earning a cool $200,000 for the fight. 2 knockout wins followed before a unanimous decision victory over Adolfo Verrett, 16-3, at the famous Dunes Hotel in Vegas. Ray floored Verrett for an 8 count in the 4th, but couldn't put him away. And after the fight, he said, "I knew he was hurt. He was still dazed. Experience pulled him through."
Once again, Angelo and Mike were at loggerheads over Ray's next opponent, and Marcus Geraldo, who was 51-14, was known as a very heavy-handed and tough Mexican that had the power to derail Sugar Ray's world title dream, which was basically in the horizon. Now, Ray recalled the moment a stinging right landed. "I'll never forget how it shook me up. I started to see 3 Geraldos in front of me, and I didn't know which one to hit. I began to dance, which was how I usually cleared my head. Not this time. I saw 3 men. Fortunately, I aimed for the one right down the middle and landed enough solid blows to capture the decision. The victory came with a cost. Ray believes this was the moment when he began to have problems with his detached retina. Ray said, while I have no proof, I believe the problems from my detached retina diagnosed 3 years later originated from the damage from Geraldo. My left eye was horribly swollen, and it was the first time that I experienced double vision."
And I mean, again, I know the stories of Sugar Ray Leonard and his issues with his eyes, but I never knew the actual origins of where this all started to come from. So again, it's good to know a little bit more about that. Now, Mike Traynor was fuming with Angelo for picking Geraldo and was keen to get rid of him. mainly because he felt Angelo did not do enough to earn his 15%, but he had to tread carefully, as he knew Ray admired Angelo and would never accept his dismissal. With Ray's consent, Mike rewrote Angelo's contract to continue to pay him the 15% of each purse. This time, though, there was a cap of $75,000 for a non-title fight and $150,000 if a title was at stake. Back to the business in the ring, and Sugar Ray won twice more by knockout before a deal was struck with the WBC welterweight champion Wilfred Benitez, who was 38-0-1. Now, after the two sides reached an agreement on money, the deal was inked for the fight to take place on November the 30th, 1979 at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas. And what a deal it was. A whopping $1.2 million for Benitez and a whopping $1 million for Ray, both record paydays at that period for non-heavyweights.
Wow, it's impressive, isn't it? Again, the fact that finally he gets that Benitez fight, obviously that the Graldo fight clearly affected him. His hands are still in tatters a little bit here as well, but he gets a chance now to fight Caesars Palace, Las Vegas. I mean, it has always been leading up to this since he's turned pro. Now, firstly, Ray had to get past the guy called Andy Price, who was 29-5-3, and there's a great story here because he was a guy that he actually knew little about until he met Diana Ross, of all people, who enlightened him. Now, Ray recalls his meeting with Diana. He said, I went to see Diana in concert several nights before the fight. We had been introduced a few years earlier by a mutual friend. Sugar, how you doing? Diana asked when I visited her backstage after the show. What are you doing here? She asked. I have a fight in a couple of nights, I said. That is so funny, she replied. Marvin Gaye told me he's managing some fight here. I think his name is Andy Price. That's the guy I'm fighting, said Ray. And he basically said they both cracked up. She said, good luck, sweetheart. And that was it. Unfortunately for Price, Ray didn't need the luck. It was Price that needed it. And he knocked him out in the first round. So, interesting story. Andy Price, if you didn't know, was managed by Marvin Gaye.
Wow, that's a great story. That I never knew Marvin Gaye actually managed any fighters. Obviously, I know a lot about Marvin Gaye. I've watched documentaries on him, and I actually like a lot of his music. And so I never knew that. I never knew Marvin Gaye actually managed a fighter, and that's a great addition for the story of Sugar Ray Leonard. Anyway, now for obviously all the preparations for the Benitez fight, he's finally ready for that first world title shot, and this fight was being televised live on ABC. The telecast also included the undisputed middleweight champion Vito Antuofermo and his draw against Marvin Hagler, and also Marvin Johnson's knockout of Victor Gellens to win the WBA light heavyweight championship. So it was a great triple header, a great card for fight fans at the time. Leonard was the 3-1 favourite despite Benitez being the more experienced fighter. The WBC, the ring and lineal welterweight titles were all on the line in what was a coming-of-age fight for Ray Leonard. The night before, Ray actually got a call from Muhammad Ali. Don't do any showboating, he warned. The judges won't like it. With that advice and his own assessment, which he said Benitez didn't like his opponents dictating the fight to him. If he was not in control, he became a little unsure of himself. I planned to keep him on the defensive the whole night. I would attack from every conceivable angle, changing speeds the same way a pitcher does on the mound. Exploiting a small advantage in reach, I would use the left jab to score points and wear him down. He also had a tendency to dip his head as he threw the left, leaving him open to my uppercut. And again, a great description in Ray's own words of how he assessed that fight going into the ring.
Yeah, he studied him really well. I mean, the description of him, I mean, it was a massive description, like a page long of this description of how he's going to break down Benitez, and I thought that was the best snippet to stick in there, and great way of explaining. Obviously, Ali giving a ring as well the night before. He was his hero. It was mind-boggling for him that Muhammad Ali. I mean, even when he was in the dressing room that time as well, I believe he called him his friend. I'm talking to my friend when they were saying, "Come on, like Muhammad, we got to go. You got to fight." And he was blown away that he actually called him a friend. So great advice and a great breakdown and description of how he was going to beat Benitez. And in front of a capacity crowd of 4,600, Sugar Ray managed to dethrone the youngest ever world champion with 6 seconds to spare in that 15th round. Now, although Benitez was taking punishment, most of the damage had already been done. So the referee, Carlos Padilla, should have allowed the Puerto Rican to finish the contest, in my opinion, and many others as well. Now, legendary historian Bert Sugar said of the fight that the Wilfred Scarpinian versus Willie Klassen fight, which took place 1 week before the Leonard Benitez fight, actually resulted in the death of Klassen. And it was probably in the back of the referee, Carlos Padilla's mind, when he stopped Leonard Benitez with only 6 seconds to go. And I think, to be honest, it probably is an accurate description of why he did stop it. Because when you watch it at the time, you think, just allow him to finish this fight. He had enough in him to do it, although he did take some severe punishment. Now, Sports Illustrated, they actually wrote of the action, and they said, if the two used every feint and manoeuvre in the first 14 rounds, science deferred to war in the 15th. Around, they both thought they needed to win. Actually, through 14 rounds, Leonard was in front by at least 2 points on all 3 cards. But the last round is definitely a really good round when they do go to war. And the fight itself, I mean, Benitez, we've said it many times, Sean, he's the other guy. I mean, you think about the Fab Four, he was another guy you could stick in there as a Fab Five, and then you got Pryor and Aguero, who I know who's further down in the rankings, but there was 7 fantastic fighters around at this time.
Wilfred Benitez and Sugar Ray Leonard is a great fight to go back and watch. Watching Ray Leonard win his first world title against Benitez is a really good watch for fight fans, and I'd implore you to watch it if you've never watched it before. It's available to watch. You can see it on YouTube. You can get really good versions of it. I'd recommend it because it's a great fighter to see, and to see how much of a ferocious fighter Sugar Ray Leonard was. This is Sugar Ray Leonard, you know, going towards the heights of what we know him as. This is you seeing him on this journey. If you watch the fight, you're probably going to sit there and then think, you know what, I want to watch the rest of the fights, because then you start to think to yourself, you know, you can just see how much he progresses throughout the big fights of his career, and how he steps up to a certain level when he's in these huge fights. Now, as soon as Ray actually realised this fight had been stopped, he described his emotions, and he said, "The next thing I remember, I was standing on the second strand of the ropes, my arms raised triumphantly in the air. I wasn't filled with the odd range of emotion I felt when I was on the podium in Montreal. I was ecstatic. The win, making me WBC welterweight champion, represented a beginning, not an end. The future was limitless." As usual, not long after the victory, attention turned to who would be Ray's next big opponent. The most likely candidates were Roberto Duran and Pepino Cuevas. Duran would get the fight, but first, Ray and Juanita got wed in January of 1980 before he had to deal with Davey Boy Green, who was 33-2, which he did in just 4 rounds. And Ray describes the feeling he got from that knockdown. "It was one punch that did it, and it was perhaps the most beautiful punch I ever threw. A short left hook coming from the body and rising to strike him flush right in the temple. Whenever I connected with such power and precision, a tingling sensation similar to an electric shock travelled directly from my hand to my shoulder. That amazing feeling went from ecstasy to anguish when Green took an eternity to get up, but thankfully he did, much to the relief of Ray Leonard."
Yeah, he was really worried when Green went down. He was in his head. He's thinking, "I've killed him." It's literally how he felt, because that punch was so pinched, just such a peach. It was inch perfect. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I always think of when I'm playing football, when you hit a ball bang in the middle, and you know you hear the noise. There's a certain noise you hear that you know you've connected well and it's going in. And it's the same with boxing. When you connect with someone's chin or the side of the head or wherever in the body, you know, when you almost hear the noise, not necessarily from something you break or from them. It's just the punch. You know that how great it is, and that's basically what he felt. It's weird how he had that feeling, and all of a sudden he almost turned into absolute tragedy because he thought Green was going to be out and out. But the fight, though, was not the main talking point, as it was an incident that happened after the bout. So Angelo Dundee was on his way to the post-fight press conference when he ran into Ray's long-term trainer, Pepe Carrera. Now, apparently, Angelo told him to move out of the aisle, and Pepe punched Dundee in the mouth, knocking him to the floor. Although Pepe says that Angelo told him to get out the way and use the N-word, either way, it was finally resolved later after some threatening behaviour from both sides, and apparently the mob were called in to iron out the differences. Believe what you want of that, but Angelo Dundee with his brother, had associations with the mob. People were actually telling Pepe to get out of town, and he wasn't interested. He said, I ain't going nowhere. Ray said Pepe shouldn't have hit Angelo, even if Angelo did use the M word, because he was an older guy. In the end, apparently, this is what Pepe said. He spoke to one of his mob pals, who then spoke to Angelo's pals, and it was sorted out. So, interesting little story. Once again, I mean, there's so many in Ray's career, but this is one we definitely needed to bring up.
Sugar Ray's next fight was against Roberto Duran, who was 71-1. A fight that we've actually already covered in great detail on our Legendary Nights podcast. So if you'd like to find out a lot more about that particular fight, please do go and listen to it. It's a great episode. The rematch with Roberto Duran was the only thing on Ray's mind after suffering that first loss of his professional career when he got beat on points to Roberto Duran. He was determined to get the fight made as soon as possible, and he and his team knew that Duran was out partying and he wouldn't be in good shape for the rematch, so they pushed to get it signed. Now, Ray had just returned from his delayed honeymoon when he called Mike Traynor. Mike, I want to fight him again. I want to fight Duran again. I can beat him. I'll fight my fight this time. He won't know what's hit him. Mike and Angelo both agreed, but not Jake, he wanted Ray to have a tune-up fight or two, but Ray wasn't interested. Jake emotionally parted ways because he was adamant that Ray would get robbed, like he felt he did in the first fight. All the while, Ray and his team were doing all they could to get this rematch in the short time, while Duran, of course, was out getting absolutely pissed and coked out of his head in New York. Don King was instrumental in getting this fight signed before the end of the year, so around the September time, Carlos Eleta, Duran's manager, called him to say the rematch will be on November the 25th, 1980, at the Superdome in New Orleans. Duran was now massively overweight, and he famously said, "Are you fucking crazy? I weigh nearly 200 pounds. I cannot drop all that weight in a month."
Yeah, we go into great detail as well about his partying antics after with Duran. Obviously, this is Ray's story, but again, you got to stick him in. I mean, these are great little famous quotes from these guys, and the fight initially obviously was made eventually, and it was shown live on closed circuit television in 345 locations in the United States and Canada. It was also televised in 60 foreign countries. Now, Duran was guaranteed $8 million and Leonard was guaranteed $7 million. When Leonard fought, he usually wore a red, white, and blue trunks and it had tassels on his shoes. But for this match, if you've never seen this match, or if you have seen it, you will notice that he is literally just wearing black trunks and black shoes with no tassels whatsoever. His frame of mind was to get revenge that night, whereas Duran's frame of mind was in nowhere near what he had in their first fight. So before leaving the dressing room, Sugar Ray Leonard asked Mike, "How do I look?" And Mike Traynor smiled and said, "You look like a mix of the Grim Reaper and an assassin." And Leonard replied, "Good," just before he walked out to take on Roberto Duran in their famous second fight.
Sugar Ray was magnificent that night. Duran just couldn't get near him, and it just frustrated him so much that he stopped fighting. And some believe no mas was actually something else, and he actually said it was no sigo, meaning I can't go on. It was just an unbelievable moment in boxing history. After the fight, Ray said, "I did everything I said I was going to do, and he couldn't accept it. He was frustrated, confused. I did everything I could to make him go off like a clock wound up too tight. He got wound up so tight, he blew a spring. I made him quit. To make a man quit, to make a Roberto Duran quit, was better than knocking him out." Angelo Dundee commented, "We were sky high in the dressing room, different from last time. Everything was cool, smooth, good. And Duran retired. I am retiring from boxing right now. I do not want to fight anymore." And what a moment that was for boxing history.
The second fight was more artistic. It was more technical, and I was able to use more of my speed and my quick feet, my thinking, my ring generalship that proved to be extremely effective with him.
Did you actually hear him say no mas?
Didn't quite hear him say no mas. That's a good question. but I saw him do this.
Yep.
And what does this mean?
Yep.
No more, right?
Right.
So there was a big controversy or debate about him saying no mas. I didn't particularly hear him say it, but this indicates no more.
Was that in some ways better than knocking him out?
Not really. Actually, not really. Looking back some 30 years later, I say yes. Back then, it was more that he quit as opposed to I made him quit. You understand? It's more so about him than about I did that to him. So that really disturbed me. It bothered me for a while. Naturally, as the years went by, I retired a couple times. Didn't make that much of a difference to me.
Oh, wow. Again, I mean, we don't want to absolutely ruin these fights. They're so famous. I mean, if you don't know about the no mass fight, which they say no mass, but it's no Seago, as Roberto Duran says. Not meaning I quit, but I can't go on. Either way, he did quit. I mean, if you're going to talk about quitting, he quit the fight. He did. Whatever he says. But we don't want to murder this with great detail because we're hoping this will come up in the second series of Legendary Nights, and as I say, it's just something we don't really want to destroy for our listeners. If you haven't seen it, please go and have a look at it. But I mean, what a moment! Absolutely amazing, and Sugar Ray Leonard that night. I mean, this is another fight I did watch again, and he's literally taking the absolute piss out of him. He really is, and Duran is in bits. He just can't cope with it. And for someone of Roberto Duran's class, no matter what he says, I mean, he was well overweight and he had to cut loads of weight and not eat. Clearly affected him. You could see he was drained. He was nowhere near the same Roberto Duran he was in the first fight, but Sugar Ray was marvellous, quite simply marvellous, and I can't say it enough. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it.
Now, after Ray had regained his WBC welterweight title, he actually got an easy payday against Larry Bonds, who was 29-3, stopping him in the 10th of a scheduled 15 before decided to jump up in weight to face the undefeated Ayub Khalil, who was 36-0 for the WBA, the ring and the lineal light middleweight titles on June the 25th, 1981. Bob Arum promoted this fight, with Ray collecting $2.5 million at the Astrodome in Houston, Texas, in front of an estimated crowd of between 25,000 and 30,000 people. Ray dominated the first 6 rounds, but the Ugandan forced his way back into the fight in the 7th and the 8th, and the Associated Press pick up the action from round 9, and they quoted, "Early in the 9th, Leonard shook Khalil with a left hook and a right to the head and backed him to the ropes with a flurry of head punches. But Khalil fought back with body shots and Leonard backed off. Then suddenly, Khalil was in trouble again after taking 2 ringing rights to the head. Again, the left-handed champion fought back, but as the round was drawing to a close, Leonard shook Khalil to his heels with a right to the head. As Khalil staggered backwards, Leonard shot home a left hook and another right that dropped him to the seat of his pants in the neutral corner. He got up, but the referee had seen enough. Now, after the fight was stopped, Leonard attempted a full 360-degree no-hand flip. However, although he had successfully practiced his move in training, he hadn't allowed for the restrictive protective cup, and he actually ended up on the seat of his arse.
Do you know what? I've only read this. I haven't seen it. It's funny that it's something I've never seen, but I'll have to go and find that because it sounds quite funny. But great performance again. Another fight where Sugar Ray is just at the top of his game, and it was just a fantastic performance. Another good fight as well for you to look at. And when the Associated Press, they describe the action beautifully well. First 6 rounds, all Sugar Ray, and then it changes slightly towards the end, but he comes through again. So a great performance from him. So now he's a 2-weight world champion, and Ray moves back to the welterweight division against another undefeated fighter in a guy by the name of Tommy the Hitman Hearns, who was 32-0, which took place at Caesars Palace at the Outdoor Arena in Las Vegas on September 16, 1981. Now, preparations were going well until an incident occurred in sparring, and Ray explains, everything was proceeding according to plan until about 2 weeks before the bout. One of my sparring partners, Ordell Hadley, accidentally struck me on the left eye with his elbow. By the next morning, my eye started to swell, and there was talk of a possibility of postponing the fight. There would be no postponement. I was determined to fight on September 16 as long as I could breathe. The arrangement that Angelo signed with Mike Traynor, which we described earlier in this episode, cost him millions, and it upset the legendary trainer dearly. He would have received 1.8 million of Ray's 12 million take instead of the $150,000 that he signed his name to on that contract. And Ray recalls a moment before the Hearns fight. He says, on the day before the bout, Angelo refused to leave his hotel room after it had been reported on television that Hearns' trainer and manager Emmanuel Stewart was taking home a much larger percentage of his fighter's earnings. And he believed in his head that Ray should have helped him out and should have given him a little bit more money, considering that he helped him a few years before and stopped him from having the first fight. Ray sort of said, well, it was his own fault because he signed the contract. But let's get it right. Although Angelo may not have been doing what they believe was enough for 15% or what Mike felt, I still think 150k, considering the millions that were involved, they should have sort of made a bit of money.
Now, the fight was shown live on closed-circuit television in 298 locations with 1.5 million seats in the United States and Canada. Pay-per-view was available to 1 million homes in 24 cities in the United States, and the fight was televised live or delayed in about 50 other countries. Some 300 million people worldwide saw the unification bout with the WBC and WBA titles on the line. In front of a sellout crowd of 23,618, both men delivered. Now, with Ray down on the cards, Angelo Dundee delivered the famous rally cry of "You're blowing it, you're blowing it" between rounds 12 and 13. Hearns had outboxed Sugar Ray for most of the fight, but that pep talk from Angelo Dundee changed the complexion of the fight, and Ray began to outpunch the puncher. Referee Davey Pearl then stopped the fight after 1 minute 45 seconds of the 14th round, while Sugar Ray was still swinging savagely, but Hearns was still on his feet, wobbling, but still on his feet. And to be fair, the ref possibly should have allowed that fight to go on, but with the scorecards all in favour of Hearns, you would have thought he would have done. And the referee stopped the fight, and that made Leonard the new champion, and the ring named Leonard versus Hearns the fight of the year for 1981, and it's actually been voted for as the 9th greatest title fight in all time as of 1996.
I just remember a long left jab, a powerful right hand, a heart bigger than the Rock of Gibraltar, tall, freak of nature, Tommy Hearns, 6'2". Tommy Hearns was a dear friend of mine, brought the best out of me, and I brought the best out of him. I see that fight vividly in my head now because going to the late rounds, he was out boxing me, and no one thought he could box. I knew he could box, but not that well, not that. His movement was precise, and his heart was just unimaginable. He never gave up, until I finally caught up with him in the later rounds. I was totally exhausted. I was only operating on adrenaline. It was just adrenaline because it was over 100 degrees in that ring, and we fighting, going for it. My left eye was closed shut. My arms were tired, weary. My gas tank was extremely low. But we both wanted to win our fight because it was for the unification of the welterweight crown. I was WBC champ. He was WBA. That fight held so much significance. It was a major fight. Yeah. One of my most, if not the most, defining moment in my boxing career.
Another epic fight. If you haven't seen it, go and have a look at it. I mean, the stoppage is interesting because could he have carried on? I mean, he's in the 14th round. Did he have another round in him? I sort of feel that he probably could have, considering that Hearns was ahead. Maybe giving him a standing 8 count or something. I don't know. He was up on the cards. There was so much controversy surrounding this fight. But again, we don't want to absolutely destroy it, but it's a great fight. If you haven't seen it, go and have a look at it. Now, Leonard made an easy defence against a full-frank fighter in Bruce Finch following a tough fight against Hearns. But it wasn't the fight that worried Ray, because he was now beginning to drink heavily and making a new friend. And his new friend, of course, was cocaine. Now, his Ray, as in Ray himself, while staying on hotel, this is what he said. He said, drinking the first mini bar bottle, I thought, what the fuck am I doing? You have a fight in a couple of days and you never drink this close to a fight. Finch is flawed, but was still a professional boxer capable of landing a knockout punch. drinking the second, and I stopped worrying about Finch. On the third and fourth bottles, I forgot why I started to drink in the first place. Little did I realise that these desperate escapes into alcohol and later cocaine would soon become an almost daily occurrence, and that they weren't really escapes at all. I was not free, furthest thing from it. And Ray's alcohol and drug problem actually started in 1983, and the abuse basically didn't stop until 1986, or later on, I think it was 2006, he said he stopped drinking.
Wow, it was crazy that. Again, it's something I didn't really know about his career. I'll be honest, I didn't really know at that period of time he was suffering with that. He was suffering with an addiction to alcohol and eventually cocaine as well. And even with the drug and drinking problem, Ray was scheduled to fight Roger Stafford on May the 14th in Buffalo, New York. But while in training for the fight, he started to see spots. A week before the fight, Ray went to see a doctor who was a specialist, and Ray recalled the news as grim. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but you have a detached retina," the doctor said. "A detached retina? How serious is that?" I replied. "Very serious." "Should I go on with the fight?" he asked. He said he wouldn't if it were him. I respected his view, but decided to seek a second opinion. Ray, Jenks, and his father flew from Buffalo to Washington and met Dr. Ron Michaels of Johns Hopkins Hospital on May the 9th. And Ray explains this meeting, and he said, "I could tell by the expression on his face that what he was about to tell me would be not what I wanted to hear. There's definitely a partial detachment," he said, "and you don't have much time. If you don't take care of this in the next week or so, you could go blind in that eye." There, he said it, the B word, the word that had been in the back of my mind from the moment I'd noticed the very first floater. Now it was out there, no longer just a fear, and there was nowhere to hide. It was as if he'd said, "You have a tumour," yet I maintained my composure. I always did, at least in public. This was not the case with Juanita. She began to sob.
Terrible news for him, and Dr. Ron Michael performed surgery to repair the retina. But although the surgery was successful and Dr. Michaels actually cleared Leonard to fight again, Leonard decided to retire. He made the announcement on November 9 at a charity event in Baltimore, with many thinking that he was going to announce a fight with Marvin Hagler. Again, you can see that on YouTube, that, if I was going to fight this great man, but I won't, kind of thing. There's a great little segment there. We spoke about it in Hagler's career profile, and Ray actually spoke to reports for the first time since the operation, telling them that the eye injury took place during the Hearns fight, and he later admitted after that, "I traced it instead to the workout when I was struck in the eye by Ordell Hardley's elbow. Only much later did it occur to me that the damage I sustained was, of course, in the Geraldo fight on May 1979, and that was the more likely cause. Either way, it made no difference. What mattered was whether my eye would heal," and had finally announced his retirement on December 1983.
Well, that makes sense as to why he was obviously suffering with abuse, with alcohol and cocaine, as part of obviously the fact that he knew there was issues going on with his eye, and that explains a lot as to why he sank into that bit of depression as well. Now, moving forward to 86, on May the 1st, Leonard was actually interviewed on WDVM TV in Washington, D.C., and he made his desire to come back and fight Hagler public. "I know exactly what it takes to beat the man." Eventually, the fight with Hagler was signed and agreed for September the 16th, 1987, with many fearing for Ray's life, but he defied the odds in a very close fight. We're not going to go through it in this episode because it's been more about the stories of Ray's career. If you want to hear about that particular fight, the tale of Hagler versus Leonard is available on our Legendary Nights feed. Please go and listen to that. An epic fight. Sugar Ray Leonard, as we know, got the decision. He beat Marvin Hagler. Very close fight, very subjective, and it was named the fight of the year and upset of the year by The Ring. Despite requests from the Hagler camp, Leonard was uninterested in a rematch, and he actually decided to retire once again in 1987. And he said, "I'll try, I'll give it a shot, but you guys know me."
Yeah, and it's definitely, please go and listen to that episode of Legendary Nights. It was one of those moments when we were doing the Legendary Nights when we started to really get the stories in, and yeah, it's a great listen. I mean, I hate to blow our own trumpet, but it is. And on November 7th, 1988, Leonard made another comeback, and he faced the Canadian or Pat Sharp lookalike. If you don't know Pat Sharp, the old fun ass, absolute dodgy barnet, that fella. Donny Lalonde, winning the WBC light heavyweight and WBC middleweight titles both at the same time. Something again we've mentioned, and we were quite surprised with that. And this was Ray's actual first professional fight of Andrew Dundee, because Andrew Dundee had left after the Hagler fight. And that same year, Ray and Juanita actually had another son, Jarrell. So, and that all happened before the fight and the draw with Thomas the Hitman Hearns. Again, we don't want to absolutely destroy these fights. I mean, I watched this fight recently. It's a great fight, a very close one. I feel like Hearns just edged it. I mean, what do you think, Sean? Another great fight. It really is another good fight.
I think when you talk about destroying fights, it's probably more about us not wanting to really cover them in great detail for this episode, only because it's a likelihood that we may cover them for another episode in the future. So rather than focus on particular fights and the background to them, I'm sure for you guys that are listening to the Career Profile series, you'll know that the stories are all about how these guys came to prominence, notable moments throughout the career, notable fights, of course, and any great breakdowns and detailed facts about a fight can be found on Legendary Nights. So that's why we always urge you to go over to Legendary Nights. And again, with the Hearns fight, when he fought Hearns, it was another fantastic fight, which I'd honestly recommend people go and watch. Yes, they're both in a different stage of the career at the point they fought again, but it's still worth having a watch. The fight actually, as you said, was scored a draw, and Leonard retained the title he held at the time. The judge Derry Roth scored the fight 113-112 for Hearns, but then the two other judges scored it 113-112 for Leonard. Eventually, Leonard admitted that Hearns actually deserved the decision. This was years later. He actually admitted that Hearns probably should have got the fight that night. So on December the 7th, 1989, after drawing with Tommy Hearns, he then fought another old nemesis in Roberto Duran in their rubber match at the Mirage Paradise in Nevada. Now, there isn't really much to say about this fight. It was a completely one-sided affair in favour of Sugar Ray Leonard. That same year, he was introduced to Bernadette Roby by Kenny G at a Luther Vandross concert. She would end up being his future wife after Ray and Juanita were divorced years later. During the divorce proceedings, Juanita testified that her husband had actually physically abused her while under the influence of alcohol, and she also said he was an occasional cocaine user. So even Juanita is coming out at the end of what usually ends up messy when you know, a long time married couple split up, and obviously he's been cheating on her for God knows how many years. She comes out and says about the physical abuse she suffered during that era of time when he was struggling with his addictions, and I'm pretty sure she probably got some pretty good money out of Ray Leonard at that time, because he was getting a shitload of money in the 80s for them big fights he was involved in as well. But I feel sorry for her, actually, because when you think about it, as much as I like Ray Leonard for the way he's able to admit to the shit that he did in his life, I do like the way that she, you know, was able to move on from that, and she was able to obviously be open and honest, and the shit she put up with throughout her life with him is unbelievable, really, when you think about it. And I'm just glad that eventually they both moved on in their lives for the right reasons.
Yeah, I mean, you say that we could have gone into so much more detail about their relationship, and you can't help but it does echo the relationship of his parents. Hence why we describe the parents' relationship just at the start of the show rather than just jumping into when Ray was born, and all the drama he had as a young child, because it was very much like his father. He used to be out playing with all sorts of different women, and Ray was the same. You know, it involved cocaine and alcohol, and you know, he would always be with women all the time. He even said it when he was on cocaine and he was drunk. He would be okay when he's sort of with the woman, and then he would do what he needs to do his deed, and it'd be after that he'd feel bad and he'd start crying. And then he would think of an excuse or buy something for Juanita. And he always described how he felt bad, how bad he felt. Whereas at the time when he was in the act, early days, he said he never felt bad. He just enjoyed himself. He didn't really give a shit. And that was probably a result of the abuse that he suffered as a child as well. And he was in his teens when he suffered that abuse. So it's going to be difficult for him, and probably difficult for him to know what he was sexually as well. I mean, you hear them stories with guys that were abused later on in life where they're not quite sure whether they're gay or not. I don't think that was necessarily the problem with Ray. I think for him, it was just, I just got to sleep with all these women to prove my manhood. Maybe it felt like it took his manhood from him, so that's why he did it. But he wasn't nice to Anita. He wasn't. He openly says it many, many times, and he regrets it. He does regret it. And for her, like you say, she did take some money. I believe it was 12 or 20 million she got from him in the end, and deservedly so, because she went through some shit. She had to basically grow up, or basically look after Ray Jr. by herself, with Ray sort of dipping in and out. And again, he openly admits that as well. So you're absolutely right, and awful for him. Eventually they ended up splitting up, and Ray did continue his career. He did fight a guy called Terry Norris on February 9, 1991, and lost by unanimous decision at Madison Square Garden, New York City. And then the Robbie girl that he was introduced to, they eventually got married as well at Leonard's $8.7 million estate in the Pacific Palisades of California in 1993, August of 93. 4 years later, on March 1st, 1997, Ray was knocked out by Hector Camacho in 5 rounds. Probably the fight you just, if you're a Leonard fan, don't even bother going watching it, because there's nowhere near Leonard that we ever see. In the years prior to this, that happened at Atlantic City, which ended his boxing career with a professional record of 36 wins, 25 by way of knockout, and only 3 defeats and 1 draw. A fantastic career when you look at it. I mean, what an absolute legend Sugar Ray Leonard is.
I suppose we've got to list off a couple of his accolades about his career. He was actually the first boxer to earn more than $100 million in purses, way before the days of the Floyd Mayweathers and the Oscar De La Hoyas of the world. Sugar Ray Leonard was the man that was earning all the money in purses. He was also named Boxer of the Decade for the 1980s. The Ring magazine named him Fighter of the Year in 1979 and 1981, whilst the Boxing Writers Association of America, the BWAA, named him Fighter of the Year in 1976, obviously because of his Olympic gold, 1979 and 1981. In 2002, Leonard was voted by the Ring as the 9th greatest fighter of the last 80 years. BoxRec ranks him as the 23rd greatest boxer of all time, pound for pound. So his outstanding achievements in his career are fantastic, really, when you think about it, because I feel personally about Sugar Ray Leonard that we were robbed of his prime. I do feel like we were robbed because of that detached retina. We lost a few years of Sugar Ray Leonard, didn't we, where he could have been involved in some of the absolute greatest fights at the time. The two fighters that I would have loved to have seen him in the ring with was Aaron Pryor, because we know the stories with Ray Leonard and Aaron Pryor in sparring, and Alexis Arguello. Them two fighters around at that particular era of time would have been fantastic fights if they would have been able to have been made. Of course, we're never going to know, but we can only theorise about how them fights would have been should them two have got in the ring. And of course, the Duran fights, the Marvin Hagler fight, even though he created this huge legacy in such a short time, I do genuinely feel like there's so many other fights that he could have had, and I feel for him, because I think he was robbed of a lot of his prime. Personally, people might argue against what I'm saying there, but I feel like because of the detached retina, a few years out of the ring, even though he came back and beat Hagler on points the way he did, and it was a very close fight, I still feel like it's kind of a case of, what if he would have had them 3 years back? Who would he have fought? How bigger would he have been as a fighter? Would he have been ranked higher? There's a lot of what ifs, but I cannot deny how much of a boxing legend Sugar Ray Leonard is.
I agree with you. I absolutely do agree with you. I don't think, the moment where he could have fought Hagler 2 years before they actually did fight as well, you could have had 2 Hagler fights in there when Hagler was basically, again, he was at his best. They had such a close fight, and it was just such a great fight that, if they had the one before as well, who knows how that could have gone. And then also, obviously, the Aaron Pryor fight. I mean, we spoke about the Aaron Pryor fight and how he literally broke down in his car when he heard the news that he had to retire because of the eye injury. But I'm with you. I think those 2 years, absolutely, he could have done more. I mean, it seems incredible that he is spoke about in such, as one of the greatest ever, but yet he only had 40 fights. When you compare, I mean, it sounds a lot today, but when you compare it against other fighters in the day, it's not a lot really. We just didn't get the chance to get more Leonard fights. I think that's the one thing, isn't it? It's just he was he was such a good fighter that you just wish you had more fights to view.
Yep.
Unfortunately, it's not the case with him, but a fantastic fighter and a great career profile again. And I hope we've got enough of those little stories in. Yeah, we haven't necessarily gone too much into detail in some of the fights that maybe some people would have liked, but if you want to do that, we've got to continue the Legendary Night segment, and it is a great way of describing these fights. So, as I say, as you rightly corrected me, we're not murdering them. We're just literally don't want to give you as much detail.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, everybody's quite well versed with the internet and a mobile phone these days that they can quite easily go on and look these things up if they really wanted to. But as we believe, people come to listen to the Career Profiles podcast because of the fact that we go into such detail about certain aspects of a fighter's life inside and outside of the ring, that it gives people a new perspective on these fighters. It gives them something they didn't already know. Because for us, what's the point of us putting into an episode content that you completely know about and you sat there going, yeah, I knew that.
Yeah.
There isn't any point. So telling these stories about Cicero and Gator, about their relationship, about the fact that Gator went and stabbed a woman in the back who slapped her around the head months before, stories like that kind of put you in a completely different picture about Ray Leonard. The way you had to break them up as they were fighting all the time, the car crash, there's so many other aspects to his life. The sexual abuse, the sexual abuse is a huge moment in his life, and it's these stories that kind of shape the man that we know as Sugar Ray Leonard, and this is why we put them in there. This is why we put a lot of context other than just talking about fights, because if we sat here and talked about fights for 1 hour and 50 minutes, it'd be a boring podcast. And why would you want to do that? You'd want to go. You might as well just go and look at BoxRec and look at his list of fights or watch it on YouTube. It's about telling a story, and I believe we've told a story of Sugar Ray Leonard's life and his career inside and outside of the ring. So if you've enjoyed this episode of Career Profiles, please go and let us know on social media at career_profiles on Twitter and the BTR Boxing Podcast Network Facebook page. I want to give a big shout out, of course, to all our patrons. We've got Nick Canada, Brendan O'Flaherty, Rob Evans, Tyler Dyer, and Benjamin Waters. Thank you so much, guys, for continuing to support the podcast network. And if you've not already checked out the Patreon page, you can do so by checking us out at patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast Network. Please go and check out all the available membership tiers on there, get early access to episodes, commissioning episodes, many other benefits about being a patron. Fight fans, this has been a great career profile. This has been about a boxing legend. This has been all about Sugar Ray Leonard.
Looking back on my first fight, there was so many distractions. I mean, the guys were coming to me at training camp. Can I get a car wreck? Can I get this? Can I get that? I was there to train, but I ended up, it was like a vacation with some of my friends and relatives. The second fight, I trained hard. I stayed focused. I stayed in the zone. That made a huge difference in the outcome of the fight.